This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The winter of 1820 arrived early in Blount County, Tennessee, settling over the Cumberland foothills like a weight that refused to lift. Along the winding path that connected the settlement of Maryville to the scattered homesteads beyond, there stood a property that local residents had learned to pass without lingering. The Ridgewell tract, as it appeared in county land records, comprised roughly 200 acres of mixed woodland and cleared fields, bordered on 3 sides by Little River, and on the 4th by a steep ridgeline that cast long shadows even at midday. The property had been purchased in March of 1819 by Cornelius Ridgewell, a man of approximately 40 years who arrived from Virginia with considerable resources and little explanation for his sudden relocation. County records show he paid in gold coin, an unusual practice that drew attention in a region where most transactions involved promissory notes or barter. The deed was witnessed by Justice Ephraim Caldwell and recorded without incident, though Caldwell would later note in his personal correspondence that Ridgewell seemed a man of education and means, yet possessed of a manner suggesting he wished to be forgotten rather than remembered. The house itself was substantial for the frontier, a 2-story structure of hewn logs with a stone foundation and chimney. What made it remarkable, according to surveyor's notes from that period, was the unusual cellar, dug deeper than typical root cellars of the time, with walls lined in mortared stone rather than bare earth. The architect, if there was one, had designed the space with what appeared to be drainage channels leading to an unknown destination beneath the foundation. This detail appears in a letter from surveyor Josiah Merrick to his brother in Knoxville, dated May 1819, preserved in the Tennessee State Archives. Cornelius Ridgewell did not live alone. With him came a woman introduced to the settlement as his sister Parthenia, though no family resemblance was apparent to those who met them both. She was younger by perhaps 15 years, with a bearing that suggested education uncommon for women on the frontier. The third member of the household was identified in census records as Silas Mercer, listed as laborer, a man of indeterminate age whose presence seemed to unsettle those few visitors who encountered him. A merchant's ledger from Maryville, still preserved in the Blount County Historical Society, shows regular purchases of lamp oil, candles, and writing paper, quantities that suggested intensive nocturnal activity. What distinguished the Ridgewell household from neighboring properties was not merely their reclusiveness, which was common enough on the frontier, but the specific nature of their isolation. Reverend Gideon Marsh, the circuit preacher who traveled through the county monthly, noted in his diary that he had attempted to call upon the household in May of 1819 to offer spiritual guidance and welcome them to the community. He was received cordially enough by Cornelius at the door, but was not invited inside. The conversation, Marsh recorded, was brief and formal. Cornelius assured him that the household attended to their spiritual needs privately and required no pastoral assistance. When Marsh inquired about the nature of Cornelius's business in the county, he received only the vague response that he was engaged in studies of natural philosophy. The troubles, such as they were initially perceived, began subtly. Residents along the river road noted that livestock, cattle primarily but also pigs and chickens, showed reluctance to pass near the Ridgewell property boundary. Teamsters reported their horses becoming agitated at a specific bend in the road roughly a quarter mile from the house, where the path curved close to the river. These accounts appear in the diary of Reverend Marsh, who traveled the route monthly and recorded such details in his observations of the territory. By autumn of 1819, Marsh noted that he had begun timing his journeys to avoid passing the property after dark, though he attributed this to practical concerns about the difficult terrain rather than any specific unease. Merchant Amos Pritchard's ledgers show that beginning in December, the Ridgewell household's purchases shifted noticeably. Lamp oil and candles increased dramatically, while food staples decreased. More curious were unusual items: mercury, sulfur, mineral salts, copper wire, and polished tin. When questioned, Cornelius explained he was conducting experiments on food preservation and water purification. Pritchard noted that Ridgewell seemed increasingly distracted with each visit, often losing track of his requests mid-sentence. What drew more widespread attention occurred in late November of 1819. A drifter seeking shelter for the night, a man who gave his name as Henry Tulloch to the proprietor of the Maryville Ordinary, mentioned having spent part of the previous evening near the Ridgewell tract. According to the account recorded by Justice Caldwell, Tulloch reported hearing what he described as singing, but not any hymn nor ballad he had ever heard, coming from beneath the ground itself. When pressed, he explained that he had been walking the river road after sunset when he stopped to rest near the property line. The sounds, he insisted, came not from the house but from somewhere below, muffled as if through layers of earth and stone. Tulloch left the county the following day and was not available for further questioning. However, his account prompted Justice Caldwell to make note of similar reports that had reached him indirectly, whispers of unusual sounds heard by those passing at night, descriptions that varied but shared certain common elements. Low rhythmic intonations, a quality of multiple voices speaking in unison, a sensation reported by more than one witness, of the ground itself seeming to pulse or vibrate subtly underfoot. Justice Caldwell, a pragmatic man who had served in the territorial militia before Tennessee achieved statehood, was not inclined toward superstitious interpretations. His initial assumption was that the Ridgewells might be hosting some form of religious gathering, perhaps members of a sect that practiced at unusual hours. However, this explanation failed to account for the apparent subterranean origin of the sounds, nor did it explain why no visitors were ever observed arriving at or departing from the property. The winter of 1819 proved harsh, and travel became infrequent. The Ridgewells were not seen in Maryville for weeks at a time. When Cornelius did appear to conduct business, merchants noted his increasingly haggard appearance. A notation in the ledger of Merchant Pritchard describes him as much altered, complexion gone gray, movements uncertain like a man who has not slept. Yet his purchases continued with regularity, including, curiously, large quantities of iron nails and hinges, along with requests for heavy timber suitable for construction. It was Parthenia who first began to attract genuine concern. In February of 1820, she appeared in the settlement alone, having walked the 4 miles from the property in weather cold enough to endanger the unprepared. Several witnesses, including the wife of Justice Caldwell, noted her condition: inadequately dressed for the temperature, hair disheveled, and what was described in one account as a manner of speaking that suggested recent distress, though she maintained composure. She purchased several items from Pritchard's store, paying in coin, and departed without offering explanation for her solitary journey or her evident state. Reverend Marsh encountered her on the road as he traveled toward Maryville that same day. His diary entry for February 18, 1820, provides the most detailed contemporary account. He met with the woman from the Ridgewell property, walking with apparent purpose, though her garments were insufficient for the weather. When he offered conveyance, she declined, but stood speaking with him for several minutes. She inquired whether he knew of any property for sale nearer to the settlement, saying that the isolation of their current situation had proven more burdensome than anticipated. Marsh noted that her hands trembled continually, though, whether from cold or some other cause, he could not determine. Most peculiar was her repeated glancing back along the road, as if she expected to be followed. When he asked after her brother's health, she responded that he was engaged in work that permits no interruption, then hurried away before he could inquire further. No property purchase was recorded, and Parthenia did not return to Maryville. However, her visit had created sufficient talk that Justice Caldwell felt obligated to make an official call upon the Ridgewell household. His account of this visit, dated March 3, 1820, exists in the county records and provides our most detailed description of the property's interior. Caldwell arrived in late morning, accompanied by his clerk, Nathaniel Shore. They found Cornelius in the dooryard, engaged in what appeared to be the construction of an additional outbuilding. Caldwell noted that the structure's purpose was unclear, and Cornelius offered no explanation. When asked about his sister's welfare, Cornelius assured them she was in good health and merely unaccustomed to frontier winters. He permitted them entry to the house, though Caldwell recorded that Silas Mercer remained visible throughout their visit, standing silently in doorways and observing without speaking. The interior was neat but spare, with few furnishings beyond what was strictly necessary. What struck Caldwell most forcefully was the absence of warmth despite a fire in the main hearth. He attributed this to the stone flooring and the apparent dampness that seemed to pervade the structure. More troubling was what he did not see. Despite assurances that Parthenia was present and well, Caldwell wrote, they neither saw nor heard any evidence of her during their visit of nearly an hour. When he requested to speak with her directly, Cornelius became evasive, claiming she was resting and could not be disturbed. The man Mercer moved to stand before the door leading to the cellar stairs during this exchange, in a manner Caldwell could only describe as deliberately obstructive. Caldwell noted other details that struck him as odd. The walls of the main room bore chalk marks, geometric patterns that appeared to have been carefully measured and drawn. When he inquired about these, Cornelius explained they were related to his studies of acoustics and the properties of sound transmission through different materials. Caldwell observed that several of the windows had been covered with heavy cloth on the interior, blocking natural light even during daytime hours. Cornelius explained this as necessary to prevent drafts, though the explanation seemed insufficient given the careful construction of the house. Most disturbing to Caldwell was a smell that permeated the structure, particularly noticeable near the cellar door. It was not the smell of decay or uncleanliness, but something he struggled to describe in his report. Mineral, he finally settled on, like whetstone and metal, with an underlying quality that reminded him of the air before a lightning strike, charged and heavy. Caldwell departed with his concerns unresolved, but without legal grounds for further investigation. No crime had been reported, no complaint filed. The matter would likely have rested there had events not taken a more definite turn in the weeks that followed. On March 15, 1820, a farmer named Josiah Whitlock, whose property adjoined the Ridgewell tract to the north, reported to Justice Caldwell that he had discovered one of his cows dead near the property line. The animal showed no obvious signs of injury or disease, but what disturbed Whitlock was the discovery of marks on the ground surrounding the carcass, patterns scraped into the earth that suggested deliberate arrangement. Caldwell examined the site himself and noted in his report that the marks formed what might be interpreted as symbols or letters, though in no alphabet he recognized. More pragmatically, he observed that the cow appeared to have died of natural causes, and the marks might be coincidental, perhaps created by other animals. Less easily dismissed was Whitlock's account of sounds he had heard on multiple nights over the preceding weeks. Living within half a mile of the Ridgewell property, he reported being wakened after midnight by what he described as chanting, multiple voices speaking in rhythm, the words indistinct but the pattern unmistakable. He had not investigated directly, assuming it to be some private religious observance, but the frequency and hour had begun to disturb his household's rest. His wife, Martha Whitlock, added her own observations when Caldwell interviewed them. She reported that on 3 separate occasions she had seen lights moving near the Ridgewell property well after midnight, not the steady glow of lamps in windows, but moving lights that appeared to be underground, visible as a faint luminescence through what she assumed were ventilation shafts or windows at ground level. A week later, 2 travelers passing through the county reported to Caldwell that they had stopped to camp near Little River, on public land adjacent to the Ridgewell tract. Both men, experienced frontiersmen named Rufus Hale and Jacob Dern, gave similar accounts of being driven from their camp by what Hale described as a feeling that something was deeply wrong with that ground. Dern was more specific, reporting that they had both heard sounds coming from beneath the earth, not the rushing of underground water, which would be expected near a river, but something he characterized as breathing, if such could come from stone and soil. They had relocated their camp several miles distant and left the area at first light. These accumulating reports prompted Justice Caldwell to organize a more formal investigation. On March 28, 1820, he returned to the Ridgewell property accompanied by 3 men: Ephraim Sutter, a respected farmer who served as constable, Reverend Marsh, and Dr. Phineas Garrett, the county's only trained physician. The purpose, as stated in Caldwell's official report, was to ascertain the welfare of all residents and to inquire into matters that have occasioned concern among neighboring property holders. They found the property in a state that suggested hasty activity recently concluded. The dooryard showed signs of digging, though the holes had been filled. The partially constructed outbuilding Caldwell had noted on his previous visit now stood complete, its door secured with an iron lock of unusual complexity. Most significantly, the house itself stood open, the main door ajar, in weather still cold enough to make such neglect of basic warmth inexplicable. Inside, they found evidence of rapid departure. Personal effects remained: clothing, kitchen implements, a few books. But the house had been stripped of anything that might indicate the occupant's intentions or destination. Dr. Garrett noted that the hearth was cold, suggesting no fire had been lit for at least 2 days. More disturbing was the condition of certain rooms. The largest chamber on the 2nd floor showed marks on the walls that Garrett, in his medical capacity, identified as consistent with fingernails scraped repeatedly across wood, leaving distinct grooves. The bed in this room remained, its ropes cut, the mattress torn open with the straw filling scattered across the floor. The smaller chambers showed different signs of disturbance. In one, they found pages torn from books scattered about, covered with handwritten notes in multiple languages. Reverend Marsh, who had studied Latin and Greek as part of his theological education, recognized some passages as corrupted versions of ancient texts, mixed with what appeared to be mathematical calculations and geometric drawings. In another chamber, the floor bore stains that Dr. Garrett examined carefully but could not definitively identify, though he noted their pattern suggested they had been deliberately placed rather than resulting from accident or spillage. It was the cellar, however, that provided the most unsettling discoveries. The stairs descended more deeply than typical for such structures, confirming the surveyor's earlier observations. At the bottom, the space had been divided into sections by temporary walls of rough lumber. One section contained stores of food and preserved goods, noticeably depleted. Another held tools and building supplies, including the remains of what appeared to be dismantled equipment whose purpose was not immediately clear, assemblies of copper wire, glass vessels, and metal frameworks. The third section, behind a door that had been locked but which Constable Sutter forced open, contained items that defied easy explanation. Caldwell's inventory, preserved in the county records, lists the following: 17 candles, burned to various degrees, a collection of metal implements whose purpose was unclear, several large pieces of slate marked with chalk drawings of geometric patterns, 3 journals filled with handwriting that Reverend Marsh, who examined them, described as partly in English, partly in what may be Latin, and partly in characters he could not identify. And most disturbing, a quantity of dark staining on the stone floor that Dr. Garrett suspected, but could not conclusively determine, might be of organic origin. The stone floor itself warranted closer examination. It had been inscribed with a complex pattern of lines and symbols etched deeply into the rock and filled with what appeared to be a mixture of wax and some dark substance. The pattern radiated from a central point where the staining was most concentrated. At regular intervals around this pattern, small holes had been drilled into the stone, each approximately an inch in diameter and of unknown depth. When Constable Sutter dropped a pebble into one of these holes, they heard no sound of it striking bottom. More disturbing was the discovery of a narrow passage at the far end of the cellar, concealed behind stacked crates that the investigators moved aside. The passage descended at a steep angle, roughly hewn through bedrock, and extended beyond the range of their lamp light. The air emerging from this passage carried that same mineral smell Caldwell had noted during his earlier visit, but more concentrated and underlaid with something else, a quality that Dr. Garrett described as similar to the smell of air after extended periods of electrical activity, though how such a smell could exist in an underground space was unclear. None of the investigators felt inclined to explore the passage fully. Constable Sutter descended approximately 20 feet before the passage became too narrow and the angle too steep to proceed safely. He reported that the passage appeared to continue downward, and that he had heard, or believed he heard, a sound from the darkness below, a low resonance that might have been moving water or wind, though the quality of it seemed wrong for either. The journals, which Caldwell confiscated as potential evidence, would later prove central to understanding what had transpired at the Ridgewell property, though their contents raised more questions than they answered. The first journal appeared to be Cornelius Ridgewell's, based on references to his business dealings and personal circumstances. The entries began mundanely enough, recording his arrival in Tennessee and his initial efforts to establish the household. However, by summer of 1819 the tone began to shift. An entry from July 1819 reads, "The excavation beneath the foundation proceeds as planned." Silas proves invaluable in this work, his previous experience with such projects evident in the precision of his measurements. Parthenia questions the necessity of such depth, but she will understand in time. The texts I brought from Virginia are clear on this point. The working requires isolation from the interference of surface sounds and vibrations. We must achieve a depth where the earth itself becomes the insulation. By August, the entries revealed more about the nature of Cornelius's project. He wrote extensively about his theories, which he called harmonic resonance philosophy. He believed that certain locations possessed natural qualities that made them suitable for what he termed opening channels of perception. His studies, conducted over many years in Virginia, had led him to conclude that the Ridgewell tract possessed the necessary geological and geographical characteristics. The proximity of running water, the composition of the bedrock, and the configuration of the ridgeline created in his theory a natural amplification of subtle vibrations that existed beneath the threshold of normal perception. By September, the entries had become more cryptic. The chamber is complete. Tonight we conducted the first trial. The resonance was weaker than anticipated, perhaps due to the composition of the local stone. Adjustments will be necessary. Parthenia grows increasingly troubled by the time required for these preparations, but she knew the nature of our purpose before agreeing to accompany me to this place. She understood that the work required absolute dedication and that the results would justify the sacrifice of comfort and conventional society. An entry from October described what Cornelius considered his first success. At precisely 3 hours past midnight, with the patterns correctly inscribed and the harmonic frequencies properly maintained, we achieved clearer perception. The boundary thinned, and what lies beyond became momentarily accessible to our senses. Silas documented the measurements while I maintained the intonation. The response we received was unmistakable, not words exactly, but a form of communication that bypassed language entirely and addressed understanding directly. Parthenia refused to participate after the first few minutes, claiming the sensation caused her physical discomfort. She does not yet appreciate what we have accomplished. An entry from November, shortly before the first reports of unusual sounds reached Justice Caldwell, stated, "Success at last." The patterns inscribed upon the floor, combined with the proper arrangement of reflective surfaces and the specific intonations, have produced the desired effect. We heard clearly the response from below, though the communication remains incomplete. Silas suggests the barrier is thinning, but not yet breached. Parthenia refuses to enter the chamber now, claiming the sounds disturb her sleep even from above. She does not understand that disturbance is a measure of proximity to success. The work requires a certain courage to face what we are revealing. The entries from December and January showed increasing excitement mixed with growing concern. Cornelius documented numerous successful sessions, each one apparently bringing him closer to his goal, though the nature of that goal remained somewhat obscure in his writings. He referred repeatedly to establishing permanent contact, to opening a reliable channel, to achieving consistent perception. He mentioned that the responses from below had become more distinct, more frequent, and more insistent. An entry from January 1820 introduced a note of alarm. Something has changed. The responses no longer wait for our initiation. We hear them now even when we are not conducting the work, sounds rising from the passage at unpredictable times. Silas reports hearing what he describes as movement in the deeper sections, though we have not extended the excavation beyond the original plan. I have attempted to explain to him that sound can travel through stone in ways that create illusions of proximity, that what seems near might actually be quite distant. But I confess uncertainty. The volume of the responses suggests something closer than our calculations anticipated. The final entries from February and March of 1820 showed increasing incoherence, mixed with passages that suggested awareness of the investigator's attention. Cornelius wrote, "They are asking questions that I cannot answer without revealing what must not yet be revealed." Parthenia threatens to speak openly of our work, claims we have gone beyond what was originally intended. She does not see that retreat is impossible now. The voices from below grow clearer each night. Something is forming in the deepest part of the passage, taking shape from the darkness itself. Silas warns that we are unprepared for what we are calling forth, but he is wrong. We are precisely prepared. That is the horror of it, that we are prepared, that we understood the risks, that we proceeded anyway. Another entry from mid-March stated, "The pattern on the floor has begun to change of its own accord. I find new marks each morning, extensions of the original design that neither Silas nor I inscribed. Parthenia denies having entered the chamber, and I believe her, for the marks appear burned into the stone rather than carved or drawn. The passage has extended itself. When I measured it this morning, it had grown 20 feet longer than our excavation reached. The stone walls smooth as if worn by centuries of flowing water, though the passage remains dry. Whatever we have been communicating with, it is excavating from its side as we did from ours. The meeting point approaches. The last dated entry, March 26, 1820, consisted of a single sentence. Tonight we descend together, all three, to see what we have opened. The second journal appeared to be Parthenia's, though it was written in a more careful, controlled hand. Her entries provided context missing from Cornelius's increasingly fragmented writings. In an early passage from April 1819, she explained that she had agreed to accompany Cornelius to Tennessee, because he had convinced her that his studies, what he called natural philosophy, concerned with the spaces between observable reality, would benefit from isolation and freedom from the skepticism of established academic circles. She had believed initially that his work was theoretical, concerned with mathematics and abstract concepts. Her entry from May 1819 revealed her growing awareness that the reality differed from what she had been led to expect. Cornelius has begun the excavation in earnest. I understood there would be a cellar, but the depth he insists upon exceeds any practical purpose. When I question this, he speaks of acoustic properties and the need for isolation from surface vibrations. Silas works tirelessly at this task, often laboring through the night. The sound of picks striking stone has become the rhythm of our household. By summer, her entries reflected increasing unease. The work in the chamber consumes all of Cornelius's attention. He has begun speaking of making contact, though with what or whom remains deliberately vague in his explanations to me. Tonight I descended to the chamber and observed them at their work. The pattern inscribed on the floor is disturbing in ways I cannot adequately express. It is not merely the strangeness of the design, but something about its proportions that causes a sensation of disorientation when viewed directly. I felt compelled to look away, yet also drawn to continue studying it. Cornelius noticed my presence and became angry, insisting that untrained observation could interfere with the delicate balance of the work. I have not returned to the chamber since. An entry from October 1819 described her first awareness of the sounds. Last night I woke to hear them in the chamber below, not Cornelius and Silas speaking, but other voices, if voices is the correct term. The sound came from beneath even the cellar level, rising as if from deep within the earth. The quality was unlike anything I have heard, neither speech nor song, but something between, a rhythmic modulation that carried meaning, even though I could not understand the words, if words they were. I lay in bed, unable to move, listening as this sound continued for what must have been an hour before it ceased. In the morning, Cornelius was exultant, claiming they had achieved their first clear reception. When I asked what he meant, he would only say that the boundaries were more permeable than conventional science understood, and that he had proven it. Her entries from November and December documented her growing alarm as the phenomena intensified. She wrote of sounds that came without Cornelius and Silas conducting their sessions, of vibrations in the walls at night, of occasions when she would descend to the main floor in the morning to find chalk marks on the walls that had not been there the evening before, extensions of Cornelius's patterns that he claimed he had not made. An entry from January 1820 revealed the depth of her fear. I can no longer sleep in that house. The sounds come every night now, rising from below, and with them a sensation of pressure, as if the air itself grows thick and resistant. On 3 occasions I have woken to find myself standing at the door to the cellar stairs, with no memory of having risen from bed or walked there. Cornelius insists these are merely symptoms of my subconscious recognition of the significance of the work, but I believe something else is occurring. I believe that whatever they have made contact with is attempting to reach beyond the chamber, and that my presence in the house makes me vulnerable to its influence. Her attempted departure in February was documented in detail. She described walking to Maryville in hopes of finding alternative lodging or employment, anything that would allow her to leave the Ridgewell property. However, Cornelius had tracked her down before she could make arrangements. His manner was not threatening, she wrote, but absolutely insistent. He reminded her that she had been present at key moments in the work, that her voice had been part of the intonations used in early sessions, and that her participation had created what he called a resonant signature that could not simply be withdrawn. If she left now, he warned, she would carry that signature with her, and whatever they had contacted would be able to follow. Whether this was genuine belief on his part or manipulation designed to keep her at the property, she could not determine, but the possibility that leaving might not actually protect her, combined with having nowhere else to go, convinced her to return. Her final entries from late March conveyed desperation. She wrote, "The passage has opened further. I can see it now when I stand at the cellar stairs extending down beyond the reach of lamplight, the walls smooth and dark. Cornelius and Silas spend hours there descending to depths I cannot estimate. They return changed, speaking in fragmented sentences, their eyes reflecting light in ways that seem wrong. Yesterday I found Silas standing motionless in the dooryard, staring at nothing, for what must have been 30 minutes before he seemed to wake and return to his tasks, without acknowledging that anything unusual had occurred. Her last entry, undated but presumably from late March based on its position in the journal, was brief. The thing in the passage has begun to speak with a voice that sounds like all our voices combined. It knows our names. It knows what we fear. Cornelius says this proves the success of his method, that we have established communication with something that exists outside normal perception. But communication is not control, and I do not believe he understands what he has actually achieved. Tonight he insists we must all descend together to complete what he calls the final confirmation. I am writing this now because I do not expect to write again. If someone finds this journal, know that we were warned by our own fears, but proceeded anyway, and whatever follows is the consequence of that choice. The third journal, presumably Silas Mercer's, contained mostly technical drawings and measurements related to the construction of the underground chamber and passage. However, scattered throughout were brief notations that suggested his own growing alarm. Unlike Cornelius's theoretical enthusiasm, Silas's observations were purely pragmatic and increasingly concerned. The resonance frequency has changed, not according to calculations. The stone itself appears to be conducting vibrations from a source we have not identified. And later, the staining on the floor cannot be removed. It spreads despite all efforts, as if seeping up from within the stone itself, rather than being absorbed into it. And finally, something moves in the darkness below the chamber. We hear it displacing stone. The passage has extended beyond our excavation. The walls in the new section show tool marks, but not from any implement we possess. The pattern is too regular to be natural erosion, too precise to be random. Something has been excavating from below, matching our work from above, approaching us as we approached it. His final entry, dated March 27, 1820, was longer than most. Tonight C.R. insists we descend to the deepest point reached by the passage. He believes we are on the verge of direct contact, that the barrier has thinned to the point where physical meeting is possible. I have tried to express my concerns, but he dismisses them as failure of nerve. He does not understand that my concerns are based on observation, not fear. The sounds from below have changed character. They no longer sound like communication, but like summoning. The vibrations in the stone have grown strong enough to be felt constantly, and the smell rising from the passage, that mineral odor we initially attributed to the stone itself, has taken on a quality that reminds me of organic decay, though nothing living has died in that space. I believe we have misunderstood the nature of what we contacted. I believe our theories were correct about the existence of boundaries and the possibility of perceiving beyond them, but incorrect about what lies on the other side. Nevertheless, I will accompany C.R. tonight, as I have accompanied him throughout this work. Whatever we find, we will find together. Based on these journals and the physical evidence, Justice Caldwell concluded that the 3 residents of the Ridgewell property had engaged in some form of experimental activity in the underground chamber and passage, that this activity had produced effects they found disturbing, and that they had ultimately descended into the passage together and failed to return. Whether this failure to return resulted from accident, from some catastrophic event in the unstable excavation, or from some other cause, the evidence could not determine. However, several details suggested something beyond a simple collapse or accident. The shoes arranged in the locked-out building remained the most inexplicable element. When examining that structure, the investigators found it empty except for 3 pairs of shoes, neatly positioned side by side, each pair showing signs of recent wear. No other clothing or personal effects were present. The arrangement was too deliberate to be coincidental, but its significance remained obscure. Additionally, the condition of the passage itself raised questions. Constable Sutter, when he descended those initial 20 feet, reported that the walls showed marks suggesting recent activity, scratches, and scrapes that appeared fresh. More troubling were his observations about the passage's construction. The initial section, clearly the work of Cornelius and Silas, showed typical excavation marks, irregular and rough. However, at a certain point, the character of the walls changed, becoming smooth and regular, with a precision that suggested either exceptional skill or a very different method of excavation. This transition occurred at approximately the depth where Sutter stopped his exploration. The property was declared abandoned and eventually sold at auction to satisfy debts. The new owner, a farmer named Harrison Talbot, attempted to occupy the house in autumn of 1820, but departed after less than a month. According to a brief note in Justice Caldwell's records, Talbot reported that the house was unsuited for habitation due to persistent dampness and disturbances that prevented rest. When Caldwell pressed for details, Talbot mentioned sounds from the cellar at night, vibrations in the floors, and a pervasive sense of unease that affected his entire family. He had attempted to seal the passage in the cellar with stone and mortar, but the sounds continued, and on one occasion he claimed to have heard what sounded like movement behind the newly constructed wall. Caldwell examined the sealed passage himself and found Talbot's masonry work to be sound. However, he noted in his private journal that he shared Talbot's sense of unease while in the cellar. Standing near the sealed passage, he experienced what he described as a sensation of being observed, a pressure against his awareness that suggested presence without visible manifestation. Being a practical man, he attributed this to the power of suggestion combined with knowledge of the property's history. But he could not entirely dismiss the feeling. The property changed hands 3 more times over the next 15 years, with no family remaining longer than a single season. Each departure was attributed to different practical concerns, structural issues, dampness, difficulty accessing markets, but the pattern suggested something beyond mere inconvenience. By 1835, the house stood empty, gradually succumbing to weather and neglect. The cellar, however, remained structurally sound, its stone walls and deep foundation resisting decay. In 1842, Professor Morton Haywood from East Tennessee University visited the ruins with students. His journals note the cellar's exceptional preservation and a sealed opening showing evidence of multiple reopenings. Their guide became agitated, claiming the space was cursed and people had disappeared nearby. Haywood did not investigate further, though in private correspondence he mentioned being awakened that night by rhythmic sounds and finding unusually deep tracks near their camp. The expedition departed the following morning. The last documented examination of the property occurred in 1867, when Blount County conducted a survey to update land records following the disruptions of the Civil War. The surveyor, Daniel Yost, noted that the house had collapsed entirely, with only portions of the stone foundation and chimney remaining visible. However, his notes include an unusual observation about the cellar entrance. Though choked with fallen timber and debris, he wrote, "The opening remains discernible, and vegetation in the immediate vicinity shows unusual patterns of growth, with certain species notably absent within approximately 50 feet of the foundation. Local residents attribute this to poor soil quality, though the surrounding land supports normal forest growth." Yost also recorded a conversation with an elderly resident identified only as Mrs. Patterson, who claimed to remember the Ridgewell family from her youth. She stated that her grandfather had been among those who searched the property in 1820, and that he had refused to speak of what he had seen in the cellar, except to say that some doors, once opened, can never properly be closed, and that the three who lived there had learned this truth too late. When Yost asked what she meant by doors, she clarified that her grandfather had spoken literally of an opening in the deepest part of the cellar, an opening that led to places the earth should keep sealed. The property eventually returned to wilderness, absorbed into the expanding forest as the cleared fields grew over. By the early 20th century, even the foundation stones had been scattered or buried under decades of accumulated soil and leaf litter. The exact location became uncertain, with property records providing only general descriptions relative to landmarks that no longer existed or had been renamed. In 1952, a historian researching Tennessee settlements discovered the Ridgewell case in archived papers. His article treated it as frontier isolation, leading to pseudoscientific pursuits. However, in private correspondence, he mentioned visiting the approximate site in 1951 with a guide. They found a circular clearing where vegetation grew sparsely. That night, the historian experienced an intense sensation of presence that prevented sleep. His guide mentioned others reporting similar experiences after visiting the site. The historian left Tennessee the next day and never returned, abandoning years of research. The Ridgewell property remains unmarked and largely forgotten. Modern topographical maps show the area as uninhabited forest land within the Cherokee National Forest boundary. The Little River continues to flow along what would have been the property's eastern edge, and the ridgeline that gave the tract its name still casts long shadows on winter afternoons. What became of Cornelius Ridgewell, his sister Parthenia, and the man known as Silas Mercer remains unknown. No graves were ever discovered. No records of their presence were found elsewhere in Tennessee or neighboring states. The journals suggest they descended into the passage they had constructed, seeking what Cornelius called final confirmation of his theories. Whether they found what they sought, or whether they found something else entirely, is a question that the physical evidence cannot answer. Justice Caldwell, in the final entry of his notes on the case, dated April 1820, wrote, "Having examined all available evidence and finding no clear indication of foul play or criminal activity, I am forced to conclude that the three residents of the Ridgewell property departed of their own accord, presumably to avoid debts or perhaps in pursuit of their peculiar studies elsewhere. However, I must record my own impression, formed during my examinations of that place, that something occurred there which does not fit comfortably within conventional explanation. The shoes arranged in that locked building, the state of that chamber and passage below, the quality of silence in that house, which was not merely the absence of sound, but something more, a pressure upon the ears, as if the air itself had been displaced by something unseen. I am a man of law and reason, not given to superstition. Yet I find myself grateful that the property lies beyond the settlement limits, and I trust it will remain unoccupied. Some questions, I have concluded, need not be answered. Some doors need not be opened, and some silences are best left undisturbed." The last known reference to the Ridgewell property in any official capacity occurred in 1968, when the United States Forest Service conducted a biological survey of the Cherokee National Forest. A team of researchers noted an area of approximately 1 acre where soil samples showed unusual mineral composition inconsistent with surrounding terrain. The report suggested possible contamination from an unknown historical source, but recommended no further investigation, as the area showed no signs of environmental damage and posed no apparent public health risk. A junior researcher on that survey, in an interview conducted many years later for a university oral history project, mentioned that the team had experienced equipment malfunctions while working in that specific area. Compasses showed irregular readings, recording devices produced unexplained static and interference, cameras malfunctioned for no apparent reason. These issues ceased once they moved to adjacent areas. The researcher attributed this to natural magnetic anomalies or equipment defects, but admitted the concentration of problems in that one location had been unusual enough to prompt jokes among the team about the area being haunted. More disturbing, though the researcher initially hesitated to mention it, was an incident that occurred during their final afternoon at the site. While taking soil samples, one of the team members had apparently called out, claiming to hear voices coming from beneath the ground. The others had heard nothing, and the team member, embarrassed, attributed it to fatigue and the power of suggestion after learning about the site's history from local residents. However, that same team member had insisted on leaving the area immediately and refused to return, even to retrieve equipment that had been left behind. The items were recovered the following day by other team members, who reported that the atmosphere of the location seemed noticeably different in the morning, less oppressive and more ordinary. Today, if one were to search for the Ridgewell property, one would find only forest. The river flows as it has for millennia. The ridge casts its shadows, and somewhere beneath the soil and the roots and the accumulated debris of nearly 2 centuries, stone walls still stand, enclosing a chamber that 3 people entered one night in March of 1820, seeking answers to questions that perhaps should never have been asked. Whether they found those answers, whether they remain in that sealed darkness, or whether they discovered something else entirely, something that Cornelius Ridgewell's texts had not prepared them for, these are questions that the surviving evidence cannot definitively resolve. What remains is the careful documentation of events by men who witnessed the aftermath, the journals of people who knew they were approaching something dangerous, and the persistent silence of a place that has resisted human occupation for 200 years. Some locations, it seems, enforce their own isolation. Some silences grow deeper rather than fading with time. And some doors, as Justice Caldwell understood, remain open in ways that simple physical barriers cannot address. The Ridgewell property stands as a reminder that human curiosity, even when guided by education and method, can lead to destinations from which there is no documented return. The boundary between knowing and understanding, between theory and reality, between calling out and being answered, sometimes proves to be thinner than we assume, and what waits on the other side may not share our intentions or our assumptions about the nature of exchange.